So today I'll be talking about After Death What by Cesare Lombroso. Now, the reason I picked this book up recently was that the name Eusapia Palladino cropped up in a couple of my recent videos. So I wanted to find out a bit more about Eusapia Palladino, and who better than to examine the work of than Cesare Lombroso, because Cesare was one of the investigators who examined the mediumship of Eusapia Palladino. Now, this book is part of Colin Wilson's Library of the Paranormal. Now, Colin Wilson is an interesting character in himself, died in 2013. He was a prolific writer, started out as a philosopher, then started examining everything paranormal and the occult. And he republished books like After Death What, which was first published in 1909. And that's interesting in itself because Cesare Lombroso mentions names like the lodges. That would be Sir Oliver Lodge and his wife. And I thought that Sir Oliver Lodge started to become interested in spiritualism after his son died during the First World War. Not so, because they're investigators of spiritualism back in 1908/9, when this book was first published. And so it's a very interesting record of early spiritualism. Now, before talking about Eusapia Palladino and her mediumship, I'll speak a little bit about the book itself. It's quite an extensive book of 356 pages with an index. That's important. And the book delves into everything paranormal. Starts out looking into hypnotism and mesmerism, which was very popular in the turn of that century, in the late 1800s. And the words used about hypnotism and mesmerism often describe what we would now call telepathy and extrasensory perception. But these people, like Cesare Lombroso and others, were coining the new terminology. And so it's very interesting the way they describe a full-form materialized spirit as a phantasm and things like that. And I found the history fascinating. And just like Arthur Findlay's On the Edge of the Etheric and Victor Zamet's book, this book treats the subject from the angle of looking into every facet of paranormal and converting Cesare Lombroso from an atheistic scientist to a fully fledged spiritualist. And that's because of the proof that he received across all his studies. And the book describes ghost stories, superbly interesting feats of beyond comprehension human endeavor, such as levitation and moving across distances. And we'll come to those during our readings from the book. There's about a dozen pages of introduction written by Colin Wilson, and they are very interesting pages in their own right. And then at the start of the book is a preface by Cesare Lombroso, dated 29th of October 1908, written in Turin, Italy. Let's read the preface and hear Cesare Lombroso's words from his own pen. When at the close of a career richer in fierce logomachy and struggle than in victory, in which I have figured as a champion of the new trend of human thought in psychiatry and criminal anthropology, I began investigations into the phenomena of spiritism and afterwards determined to publish a book on the subject. My nearest friends rose against me on every side, crying, "You will ruin an honourable reputation, a career in which, after so many contests, you had finally reached the goal, and all for a theory which the whole world not only repudiates, but, worse still, thinks to be ridiculous." But all this talk did not make me hesitate for a single moment. I thought it my predestined end and way, and my duty to crown a life passed in the struggle for great ideas by entering the lists for this desperate cause. The most hotly contested and perhaps most persistently mocked at idea of the times. It seemed to me a duty that up to the very last of the few days now remaining to me, I should unflinchingly stand my ground in the very thick of the fight, where rise the most menacing obstructions, and where throng the most infuriated foes. And one cannot in conscience blame those opponents, because spiritistic phenomena, as commonly conceived, seem designed to break down that grand idea of monism, which is one of the most precious fruits of our culture, retrieved by so sore a conflict from the clutches of superstition and prejudice, and because, furthermore, when contrasted with the precision of experimental phenomena, always accurately tallying with each other in time and space, spiritistic observations and experiments, so frequently varying with different mediums, according to the time of day and according to the mental state of the participants of the seance, notwithstanding their frequent repetition and reinforcement by accurate mechanical instruments, and however carefully sifted out by the most severely scientific experimenters. One need only name such men as Crookes, Richer, Lodge, James, Hislop, are always wrapped in a dim atmosphere of uncertainty and show a tinge of medieval science. But note this well, that, however doubtful each separate case may appear, in the ensemble they form such a compact web of proof as wholly to baffle the scalpel of doubt. In psychical matters, we are very far from having attained scientific certainty, but the spiritistic hypothesis seems to me like a continent incompletely submerged by the ocean, in which are visible in the distance broad islands raised above the general level, and which only in the vision of the scientist are seen to coalesce in one immense and compact body of land, while the shallow mob laughs at the seemingly audacious hypothesis of the geographer. A converted spiritualist, after concluding all these studies, and he died quite young for, even in that era, he was only about 47, Cesare Lombroso. What was the story about Eusapia Palladino? Well, there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, about Eusapia, because she's known as a gypsy in her upbringing or whatever. But, let's have a read of what Cesare has to say. Here we are, Chapter 2, Experiments with Eusapia. After having convinced myself of this, the chief objection had disappeared, which I had to occupying myself with spiritistic phenomena, as phenomena that could not really exist because contrary to physiological laws, and, although the thing was still repugnant to me, I ended by accepting in March 1891 an invitation to be present at a spiritualistic experiment in full daylight in a Naples hotel and a tete-a-tete with Eusapia Palladino. And when I then and there saw extremely heavy objects transferred through the air without contact, From that time on, I consented to make the phenomena the subject of investigation. Eusapia Palladino was a poor orphan girl born at Merge in 1854 and abandoned by the roadside, so to speak. As a young girl, she was received out of charity as a nursemaid in a family of the upper bourgeoisie. From the time when she was a little girl, she had manifestations, either mediumistic or hallucinatory, whichever they were, without being at all able to explain them to herself, such as hearing raps on pieces of furniture on which she was leaning, having her clothes or her bed covers stripped from her in the night, and seeing ghosts or apparitions. In 1863, Damiani, who at a séance in London had already heard a mediumistic communication from John to the effect that there was a medium in Naples, John, a spirit guide, affirming her to be his daughter. Damiano, I repeat, was present at a spiritualistic séance in the house of the family in which Eusapia was living. During this séance, her participation in the proceedings was attended by the most extraordinary phenomena of raps, movement of objects, etc. From that time on, Damiani and Chiaya had a true mediumistic education through her, and the poor nurse girl, finding in this means of gain a method of introducing variety into a miserable occupation, went on from time to time attending séances until the business of mediumship became her sole occupation. The description of all the experiments made in Europe with Eusapia Palladino would fill a huge volume. We shall simply content ourselves with describing in full the 17 séances held in Milan in 1892 with myself and with Aksakoff, Riche, Giorgio Finzi, Ermacora, Proferio, Geroso, Schiaparelli, and Duprel. Séances in which the most marked precautions were taken, such as searching the medium, changing her garments, binding her, and holding her hands and feet, and adjusting the electric light on the table so as to be able to turn it off and on at will. And then we have several pages describing 17 séances that Cesare Lombroso personally attended. And they're all very interesting, and they range from the very simplistic, to table tilting and messages via table tilting, and levitations, and of course, materialisations. Let's skip to the levitation of the medium to the top of the table. Among the most important and significant of the occurrences, we put this levitation. It took place twice. That is to say, on the 28th of September and the 3rd of October. I think that was back in 1891. I think I read that date. The medium, Eusapia Palladino, who was seated near one end of the table, was lifted up in her chair bodily, amid groans and lamentations on her part, and placed, still seated, on the table, then returned to the same position as before, with her hands continually held, her movements being accompanied by the persons next to her. On the evening of the 28th of September, while her hands were being held by Messieurs Riche and Lombroso, she complained of hands which were grasping her under the arms. Then, while in trance, with the changed voice characteristic of this state, she said, "Now I lift my medium up on the table." After 2 or 3 seconds, the chair with Eusapia in it was not violently dashed, but lifted without hitting anything on to the top of the table. And Monsieur Richet, that's Charles Richet, and I are sure that we did not even assist the levitation by our own force. After some talk in the trance state, the medium announced her descent. And Messrs. Finzi, having been substituted for me, was deposited on the floor with the same security and precision, while Messrs. Richet and Finzi followed the movements of her hands and body without at all assisting them, and kept asking each other questions about the position of the hands. Moreover, during the descent, both gentlemen repeatedly felt a hand touch them on the head. On the evening of October the 3rd, the thing was repeated in quite similar circumstances, Messrs. Duprel and Finzi being one on each side of Eusapia. So these are very well-known scientists asserting this claim that the medium in her chair was levitated up from its position at the head of the table and deposited gently onto the top of the table. Well, the chair alone would have weighed quite a bit. And these people did great experiments with weight, and they lifted the mediums and chairs, tables, etc., and found different weights for taking place in these experiments with the movement of the spirit. In modern day, I've seen video footage of one of the mediums sitting in the Cristanucci seances, and the film that she used to have on her website showed that the male medium, I forget his name, sorry, was slid across the floor out of the cabinet while sitting in his chair, and the whole chair with the medium in it slid across the floor in full light, because they did their mediumship in light in that particular seance. So very interesting. So what took place in the present took place in the past and vice versa. Here's an interesting one from the same chapter. It's phenomena hitherto observed in the dark, now at length obtained in the light, with the medium in full sight. In order to attain complete conviction, it remained for us to attempt to secure important phenomena in the light. But as darkness is very favourable to their production, we proceeded in the sitting of October the 6th as follows. In order that one part of the room might be left in darkness, it was separated from the rest by a curtain which was divided in the middle, and a chair was placed for the medium before the aperture in the curtain. Her back was in the dark part, while her arms, hands, face, and feet were in the illuminated portion. Behind the curtain were placed a little chair and a small bell about 1.5 feet from Eusapia, and upon another, more distant chair was placed a vessel full of moist clay. In the illuminated part of the room we formed a circle around the table, which was placed before the medium. The room was lighted by a lantern with red glass sides, red light. Presently the phenomena began. We saw the inflated curtain blowing out towards us. Those who sat near the medium, on opposing their hands to the curtain, felt resistance. The chair of one of them was vigorously pulled, then 5 stout blows were struck on it, which signified less light. We thereupon softened the light of the red lantern with a shade. But a little afterward we were able to remove the shade, and instead the lantern was set on the table in front of the medium. The edges of the curtain where it was divided, were fastened to the corners of the table, and at the request of Eusapia, the upper parts were also folded back above her head with pins. Then, above the head of the medium, something began to appear and disappear. Monsieur Aksakov rose, put his hand in the aperture of the curtain above the head of the medium, and announced that fingers had touched him several times. Next, his hand was grasped through the curtain. Finally, he felt something thrust into his hand. It was the little chair. He held it firmly. Then the chair was snatched away from him and fell to the floor. All present put their hands through the curtain and felt the contact of hands. How marvellous. And you'll remember that Stuart Alexander and Bill Meadows often received hands formed as the hand was being felt in the David Thompson seances. Very interesting. I felt the hand in the David Thompson seance. In the dark background of the aperture itself, above the head of the medium, the usual firefly-like bluish gleams appeared several times. Now, I've saw what we call spirit light in the blacked out seance in Clevedon, in the Cristanucci seance with the female medium. And it's a beautiful sight. It was like a rainbow of 3 or 4 different colours, red, black, white and blue. But I was, unfortunately, the only one to see it. So I'm seeing it with my mediumistic faculties. But it's a beautiful sight. And it's described here. Monsieur Schiaparelli was forcibly struck through the curtain both on the back and side. They're a bit tough in them days, aren't they? His head was covered by the curtain and drawn into the dark part, while he with his left hand kept holding all the time the right hand of the medium, and with his right the left hand of Mr. Finzi, Monsieur Finzi. In this position he felt himself touched by the warm bare fingers of a hand, saw the light gleams describing curves in the air, and lighting up a little the hand and the body, which was carrying them. Then he took his seat again, whereupon a hand began to appear in the aperture, without being withdrawn, so suddenly and in a more distinct way. Monsieur Duprel, without letting go of the hand of the medium, put his head into the aperture above her head, and received some hard blows from several quarters, and by more than one finger. Well, he put his head in there. What do you expect? The hand was still showed itself between the two heads. Duprel resumed his place, and Monsieur Aksakoff held a pencil up to the opening. It was grasped by the hand and did not fall to the floor. In a little while it was flung through the aperture onto the table. Once a closed fist appeared on the head of the medium. It opened slowly and showed the hand open with the fingers spread apart. It is impossible to state the number of times that this hand appeared and was touched by us. Suffice it to say that no doubt was any longer possible. It was actually a living human hand that we saw and touched, while at the same time the entire bust and the arms of the medium remained in sight, and her hands were continuously held by her neighbours on each side. There are many descriptions of apports and sounds of trumpets, contacts with faces of the spirit people. Here's an instance of apports. One of us at the beginning of the seance had laid his overcoat on a chair beyond the reach of the medium. At the close it was seen that several different objects had been brought and laid on a phosphorescent cardboard that was on the table. The owner of these articles recognized them at once as having been in an inside pocket of his overcoat. Hereupon the medium began to lament and make sounds and signs of displeasure, complaining of something that had been put about her neck and was binding her tight. We produced light and found that the overcoat was not in the place where it had originally laid, and then, giving our attention to the medium, discovered that she had on the overcoat in question, her arms being slipped into it, one in each sleeve. During the sitting, her hands and feet had been always controlled in the usual way by the two who sat next to her. So throughout the seance, her hands and feet were being held and touched. And yet an overcoat was put on her and her arms through the sleeves of the overcoat. It's just amazing, isn't it? And that sort of thing happens with the David Thompson seances, in that they'll completely turn around the cardigan that he'll be wearing. So the details of the 17 seances go on, and then summarized by, I think it's about 40 odd. It's about 40 odd different forms of phenomena that the variety of scientists who investigated Eusapia Palladino recorded. And they range from minor forms of phenomena. That's a good word, minor, isn't it? And these phenomena vary, and they've been summarized by Professor Morselli. And they vary from objects being moved in contact with Eusapia to right through every other facet of phenomena, right through to full form materializations, visible with the eye. So let's read the culmination of the list of phenomena. Phenomena number 40, apparition of forms having the human appearance or character. These are the complete materializations and form the apex of achievement so far attained by Eusapia. Other mediums, among which are Florence Cook and Madame d'Esperance, give much more marvelous instances of full form materializations. And in the modern world, Helen Duncan, Alec Harris, and to name but a few. With Eusapia, they are faces accurately delineated, heads and figures and half busts of personages who are identified and named, the medium availing herself of notions obtained from the traditional history of spiritualism. In this case, one must admit that Eusapia acts upon certain invisible defunct beings in such a way as to make them conduct themselves as living beings, a fact demonstrated not merely by the playing of certain instruments and the sounds of voices, but by graphic registrations and reproductions of movements much more complex, and with instruments which she cannot influence with her individual will. Furthermore, Eusapia can bring before our eyes the images of deceased persons of whom she had no knowledge before the seance. So that's the culmination of Eusapia's phenomena, full form materializations. I think they saw a lot of arms and legs, and a third arm or a third leg, which might appear in the seance, was recognized as Eusapia's own arms or legs. So there's a whole chapter on spirit double, and one of the conclusions that Cesare drew was that such medium activity uses the medium's own spirit equivalent, spirit counterpart or double, the spirit body that we will use as our vehicle when we transfer ourselves through that thin veil we call physical death. So her own physical body was used to manifest the appearance of solidity of an arm or a leg in certain circumstances. Very interesting. Eusapia Palladino had a lot of crafty tricks. up her sleeve because she learned it not as a child from a gypsy background, but from periods spent in her development as a medium with maybe, I wouldn't say fraudsters or tricksters. They got words for them here, and I'm not 100% sure what the word translates. I'll have to look it up. I thought it translated as pickpocket. So she fell in with people who taught her um, certain things like that. Listen to what Cesare has to say about her tricks. Many are the crafty tricks she plays, both in a state of trance, unconsciously, and out of it. For example, freeing one of her two hands held by the controllers for the sake of moving objects near her, making touches, slowly lifting the legs of the table by means of one of her knees and one of her feet, and feigning to adjust her hair, and then slyly pulling out one hair and putting it over the little balance tray of a letter weigher in order to lower it. And that refers to some of the physical experiments that they undertook, using, trying to find out the weight of spirit activity and the effects of spirit activity on the weight of the medium, etc. She was seen by Pfeiffer, nice name, before her seances, furtively gathering flowers in a garden that she might feign them to be apples by availing herself of the shrouding dark of the room. It would seem also that she had learned from certain, this is the word, prestidigitated acteurs. It's got the word digit right in the middle of it. She learned from certain sleight of hand, tricksters, pickpockets, some special tricks. For example, that of simulating human faces by movements of the two hands wrapped with a handkerchief, so as to look like a turban. And yet her deepest grief is when she is accused of trickery during the seances. Accused unjustly, too, sometimes. It must be confessed, because we are now sure that phantasmal limbs are superimposed or added to her own and act as their substitute, while all the time they were believed to be her own limbs detected in the act of cousining for their owner's behoof. Lovely turn of phrase. And that's translated, of course. The translator did a great job as well. So Cesare found conclusive proof after the extent of all his researches that the limb that undertook some of the so-called tricks was actually a spirit limb, although it appeared to be Eusapia's own forearm or arm or leg. Very interesting, that, isn't it? The book goes on and on to describe the experiments in great detail and the lengths that they took. And there's pictures a lot of the experimentation and the instruments used. The table lifting photographs are superb. And she may have done the odd one with her knee, as they mentioned. What a wonderful character, and selfless as well, because she undertook a great many experimental seances at inconvenience to her own person, with all the searches, etc., and the way they imposed restrictions upon her, with numerous different researchers, not just Cesare Lombroso. There were countless over different periods of time in lots of countries as well. Probably one of the most researched mediums ever, Eusapia Palladino. This is one story that I found interesting, and these stories throughout the book, and there's lots and lots of them. And this is just a small snippet, and it's in amongst lots of other descriptions. We'll start with a bit about Eusapia. It has been observed that Eusapia has a great antipathy toward technical instruments of experimentation and is completely ignorant of how they are manipulated. Now, it is curious to note that in experiments in Genoa, Naples, and Turin, John, I think that's a spirit guide, could close and open interrupters. I think they are switches in electrical circuits. Press Mary's drums, must be somebody who's invented something. Adjust a stethoscope and put a metronome in movement. There's one suggestion that John is John King, related to Katie King, who was the guide of and materialized form of Florence Cook, medium, investigated by Sir William Crookes, amongst others. And how explain the impromptu and very beautiful sculptures of Eusapia, who is entirely ignorant of the art of Phidias? Yeah, beautiful sculptures. And and in what way solve the mystery of the spirit of Spencer Stafford revealing the principle of the telephone to Madame d'Esperance, who was ignorant of physics? And that was 30 years before the discovery of the telephone. That's fascinating. This is the bit I was intrigued by. The novel of Edwin Drood, left incomplete by Charles Dickens, was finished by the 14-year-old medium, James, a mechanic and almost unable to read. I think he was an American youngster. He did not believe in spiritualism, but was besought by Dickens, in spirit, to continue the novel under his dictation. It is interesting to note that the orthography is English and not American. The young 14-year-old James being an American. And to observe the frequent passing from the past tense to the present, a special peculiarity of Dickens's style. James entered into a trance and saw Dickens fix him with his glance. He did not know what he was writing, but when he awoke, found the floor littered with unnumbered manuscript slips, and on every page the writing was larger than on the one that preceded it. And that's described by Professor Aksakoff. This has to be my favorite, I think. A man called Laponi, a Catholic and physician to the popes, hence an unimpeachable witness, records the case of the child Alfred Pansini, who, at the age of 7, during spiritistic trances, would speak with a voice not his own, precisely in the manner of a true orator, frequently speaking languages of which he had no knowledge, such as French, Latin, or Greek, even going so far as to recite in a marvelous way entire cantos of the Divine Comedy. At the age of 10, with his brother Paul, aged 8, without knowing how or why, he saw himself transported in half an hour from Ruvo to Molfetta. Another day, the two children found themselves in a scant half hour from Ruvo, seated in a boat at sea near Barletta. Another time, in 10 minutes, they were at a distance from Ruvo and in front of the house door of an uncle of theirs, before whom Alfred made the prediction that they would not be able to depart next day, not until 15 days had elapsed. In fact, the next day the uncle's horse was taken ill. Then the aunt hired a carriage to take back her nephews to Ruvo. But no sooner had they reconsigned to their parents than they disappeared again, and again found themselves at Trani. Being sent back to Ruvo, they disappeared once more and found themselves in Bisceglie. Then, convinced that they were struggling in vain against superior powers, they betook themselves to Trani to await the expiration of the 15 days. And that is written in a book, Laponi's book, Hypnotismo e Spiritismo, published in Rome in 1906. And this book is filled with quotes from books right across that period of time that Cesare Lombroso himself has read. So the unimpeachable witness statements of the researchers who wrote the books. So it's an interesting source of really old spiritistic literature. And that's the one thing about spiritualism, isn't it? You don't just read from one book. But isn't that phenomenal to hear about two boys picked up and transported? They don't know how, gone. And these are in days when you use horse and carriage. There may have been trains around, but it's all very basic stuff. And they were too young to use the train anyway, by the look of it. Sounds totally implausible matter to be dematerialized and rematerialized, or however they were transported. But, you know, you've got books by Louis Harris, rather, about the mediumship of Alec Harris. Other books, and I think it's quoted in Alan House's 60 Years as Spiritualist. You read about people being dematerialized and rematerialized. And because, as stated by Cesare Lombroso in his preface, it's not one person saying it. It's probably hundreds that they've witnessed things like this. Don't believe one person, but you've got to believe 100, haven't you? D.D. Home gets a mention throughout this book, Daniel Dunglass Home. The interesting thing about the book is the short stories from the lives of other mediums, such as Daniel Dunglass Home, quoted by F.W.H. Myers and Barrett. And the book is called On Daniel Home, and that's dated 1900. And I love these little stories. It says, at another time, the medium Home mentioned to Pisk a portrait of his mother with a Bible on her knees. Mr. Pisk began to rummage through the house and finally discovered a daguerreotype. That's an early photograph, taken 20 years before, in which the mother was depicted in precisely the attitude mentioned. Now, it was impossible that Hume could ever have seen it, even if he was not ignorant of its existence. So that's mental mediumship then. Daniel Dunglass Hume, famous for levitations. Right, this is the bit that I like about Daniel Dunglass Hume. Still more important, both for their greater personal authority and in respect of the nature of the facts, are the observations of Stanton Moses, his book Spirit Teachings, and others. Having entered into communication with a personality claiming to be one Horn, born in 1710, the son of a music master, and who was stated by whom he had been educated and with whom he had been intimate, Home undertook investigations and found every specification to be most exact. Furthermore, when he requested him to write for him the last line of Virgil's Aeneid, this was reproduced with accuracy. But Moses, being in doubt, lest his, as Moses, unconscious memory or his suggestion might have influenced him, he asked him to reproduce the last lines of page 94 of the last volume in the third row of his library, the very title of which he did not know himself. So he's doubting his own unconscious mind. Could he have influenced the last line of the poem Aeneid? The lines specified were accurately written down. How is it possible to try to explain these performances by vestiges of unconscious cerebration if the vestiges themselves never existed? We may call them specimens of vision at a distance or remote viewing. A child entered into communication with us, writes Stanton Moses, who gave the names of two of his brothers and the date of their death in India. No one knew them, and yet their names were verified by Walzer. Cross correspondence. And we're now talking about full-form materializations, phantasms. Hence the fact of the appearance of entire phantasms that took living form for a brief period and occasionally for a long time under our very eyes no longer remains completely incomprehensible and unreducible to the grand laws of monism. At any rate, the thing has been proved over and over again. The case of Katie King, which was for 3 years under the observation of the most eminent English experimenters, seems to me free from all suspicion, even as to the most mysterious and most controverted phenomena, reincarnation. Florence Cook, medium, without the existence of any predisposition on her part, felt impelled to take up the life of a psychic when still under 15 years of age, after having been present at a spiritualistic séance at the house of a lady friend. On this occasion, the table in her presence rose clear to the ceiling of the room, and knocks and direct writing revealed her extraordinary power as a psychic. After a few séances, the phantom form of a woman began to appear before her, palpably visible to all present. A trick being suspected, the medium was bound, and the bands sealed, and she herself held immovable, in a niche in a wall like a mummy, and placed under the control of the well-known scientists Sir William Crookes, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Varley. But for 3 years the phantasm continued to appear. She called herself Katie King, presumably the daughter of Asapia's John King. She would write and speak and was as tall as the psychic. But whereas Florence had long dark hair, Katie's was somewhat blonde and was cut short. Her heart, osculated by Crookes, showed 75 pulsations against the medium's normal 80. The apparition of Yolanda under the mediumistic influence of d'Esperance also continued for 3 years, and it was found possible to photograph her. A man called Marata in Barcelona in the 4th séance with the psychic Carmen Dominguez obtained the apparition of Eleonora, a phantasm completely materialized, who saluted the experimenters in a voice slightly veiled. She disappeared, then, after a few minutes, returned again, went in and out of the cabinet several times, and once remained among the experimenters for nearly an hour. Showing herself possessed of an uncommon intelligence and disposition, during her appearances she sat down 3 or 4 times in a chair, drawn out of the psychic's cabinet by herself, gave her hand to the spectators, allowed her chevelure of black hair to be touched, and also her white robe, which seemed to all as if made of the finest tulle, and to gleam with luminous reflections. And that comes out of the book by Aksakoff called An Isme. Fabulous witness statements of full form materializations. So going back to the form of the spirit Yolanda. The spirit personality called Yolanda was a semi-barbaric girl without native genius, but very curious. When she first appeared out of the shadow world, she did not know what a chair was, but tried to sit on its back and fell. She did not exhibit any affection and played with the children of Fiddler because she was used to it. At the age of 10, she barely knew a few letters of the alphabet, but had a great desire to be praised and approved. She knew at once the use of jewels. Her body was so real, so carnally feminine, that a person who took her for a real woman attempted to offer her an indignity, resulting in profound injury to the medium, to whom it caused an illness and almost was mortal, and that was Madame d'Esperance. But the complete phantasm is very rare, and the phenomena is rounded out and completed by those fragments of phantasms, arms, hands, etc., which appear in almost every psychic seance. And even if these apparitions, complete and incomplete, had not appeared, should we not have the proof of their presence and action in those intelligent phenomena and acts, sometimes aesthetic and artistic, which takes place at a distance from the medium, beyond her sphere of externalization, in which she has not the skill or competency to perform? I don't know a great deal about Madame d'Esperance, but her descriptions of being a full form materialization medium are superb, and she requires further study. They experimented with Madame d'Esperance and encased her in a net, and these photographs of the lady in the net are superb. There's no question in my mind that Madame d'Esperance was a bona fide full form materialization medium, because in one of her seances, and it's described in the book somewhere, but I've lost it, unfortunately, the description is given that the light is put on by mistake or out of malice, and from darkness to full light was such a shock to the medium that it put Madame d'Esperance to her bed for a couple of years, I think, paralyzed, and didn't kill her, thankfully. But when it talks about someone being paralyzed from nothing, as a reaction to light in a seance, then you can see how dangerous this work has been across the years. And you can accept that Helen Duncan was a bona fide full form materialization medium when she died about 6 weeks after light was introduced maliciously in her last seance. And it happened to Alec Harris. Light was introduced in a seance in South Africa maliciously, and he died about 2 years after that event. And Louis Harris says he was never the same health-wise after the event, and died 2 years after it. When before the event, he was a very robust, strong 72 or 74-year-old figure of a man, and died 2 years later. So, it's very dangerous handling full form materialized spirit people. Madame d'Esperance. The book goes into great detail of stories of materializations, etc., so other psychic phenomena across history, and a great many instances of spiritualism occurred prior to 1848, and that's mentioned in the book. And here's one story from 1750. More curious still is the narrative of a certain Henry, a prisoner of the Huron, Native Americans, Native Canadians, during the War of 1750. In the councils of this warlike tribe, the question came up, ought they to accept a proposal made by Sir William Johnson to send their chiefs to Fort Niagara to conclude a peace treaty? The question at stake being one of the very highest importance, they wished to consult the spirit of one of their celebrated chiefs deceased, whose name was Great Turtle. This ghostly warrior manifested himself in the magic wigwam, first by shaking it, and then by his voice. On being asked if there were many soldiers at the fort, he disappeared and then returned, saying there were very few, but that there were many of them along the river in small boats, and further said that if the chiefs went there, they would be loaded down with presents. And all this happened as the voice stated. So that was a testimony by a prisoner of the Huron tribe describing how the Huron manifested spirit forms prior to 1848. Needless to say, in many modern times also have believed in spiritism and the apparition of phantasms, even before Swedenborg. And in our time also, before the famous occurrences that took place in the Fox family at Hydesville, New York in 1848, and from which modern spiritism dates. Kaiserwetter gives us an accurate list of those who have written about it, between 600 and 700 statements. Wallace, in Chambers' Encyclopedia, 1892, refers to the following: the long series of disorders and noises that took place in the Old Hall in Woodstock in 1649, those that happened in Monsieur Montpesson at Redworth in 1661, those of Epworth in 1716, in the family of the Wesley, who became the founders of Methodism, the ghost of Cock Lane, which was a case examined by Dr. Samuel Johnson, Bishop Percy, and other gentlemen, the extraordinary facts in the case of Mr. Jobson in Sunderland in 1839, which was studied and published by Dr. Clanny, member of the Royal Society, and certified as authentic by 16 witnesses, among whom 5 were doctors and surgeons, and many less important occurrences referred to in the works of William Howitt, Robert Dale Owen, famous as a founder of British cooperatism, Dr. Eugene Crowell, and others. Alfred Russel Wallace cites only English examples and knows nothing of those narrated by Duprel, Purty, Young, Stilling, and a whole phalanx of German writers of his day, whose names the reader will find in the catalogue of Sigismund. Certain persons wish to present before Lodovico the Moor, a youth through whose mediation the spirits became visible, looking at men face to face. John B., the famous mathematician and astronomer at the court of Queen Elizabeth, held a long series of spiritistic seances with the medium Kelly, and preserved reports of them, published in that day by Casaubon, 1659, Cardano, and Benvenuto Cellini, possessed the mediumistic faculty. The former affirmed that he had spoken with the elemental spirits. The latter admits in the second book of his autobiography that he called up malignant spirits. Finally, in the phenomena of the doubling of the personality and the levitation of sorcerers, and their power to act at a distance. In the divining rod, noticed as early as the time of Paracelsus, and of Agricola, in whose scholars practically operated by the married couple. In all these things we have representations in quasi-modern times of the same phenomena that the spirits produce in the seance cabinets of our latest psychics. And there we have it, a whole list of study of spiritualistic phenomena prior to 1848, and how spiritualism didn't get born before 1848 is now a minor miracle. I mentioned earlier about doubles. There's a whole chapter in the book on a counterpart, a spirit counterpart to the physical body, the double. And having quoted a lot of examples of doubles, for instance, the German philosopher Goethe, who, on coming away on horseback from a field of battle, after experiencing deep emotion, perceived the apparition of his own double riding alongside him. We may then say, after a survey of foregoing strange phenomena, that the existence of the wraith or double is an ascertained fact for all the more or less anomalous states of the psyche, and especially in magnetic and hypnotic states. It further appears that the double has the power to go to a distance from its partner and act with quasi-independence of the proper I. Is it not then probable that this double, just as tradition and the Greek philosophy assert, remains whole and perfect, capable of acting after death, standing for what the ancients called the anima, the phantasm of the dead? The double may furnish an explanation of many spiritistic phenomena without having recourse to the spirits of the dead, substituting for these the action of the medium, the body of the double, or a part of it, acting at a certain distance from the medium's living body, just as this itself would act. Perhaps to the double belong also those more or less incomplete limbs which are seen to emerge from the body, the shoulders or the skirts of the medium. So also, perchance, with some of those floating hands or arms which exactly resemble those of the medium, so much so that they have given rise to suspicion of deceit. The double would also account for the visual power and the perception the psychic has as to whatever takes place in the room in complete darkness. Explains perhaps the strange phenomenon of the transposition of the senses, by virtue of which a person sees with the proper eye, smells with the knee, feels with the nose, which was described early on in the book in chapter 1, and finally throws light upon one of the strangest phenomena of hysteria, which heretofore we have not been able to account for. It may also solve the problem of clairvoyance and explain the power of seeing through opaque bodies and the possibility of distinguishing by touch alone metals which externally present no differences whatever, and how the body of a sleeping person can project a counterpart of itself to a great distance. It's all very interesting because my review of Joe McMonagle's book, where the Stargate Protocols, where he describes his work as a CIA remote viewer. And in that book, he says that his double was seen to go ahead and beat somebody up in another city in America, whilst his physical body was, where it should be, in maybe Florida. But he would have had a good excuse for causing grievous bodily harm. Imagine that, though, your double being able to have an effect on the earth plane. Chapter 11, Transcendental Photographs and Plastiques. The first spirit photographs. The reality of the existence of phantasms and proof that they are not a subjective hallucinatory phenomenon are also afforded us by the so-called spirit photographs. In March 1861, Mr. Mumler, head engraver in the firm of Bigelow, Kennard and Co., who were jewelers in Boston, Massachusetts at that time, employed his leisure hours in making photographs. One day he detected on one of his proofs a figure that did not belong to the group he was developing. He concluded from this that the plate must have received a previous impression and that it must have been put by mistake among the new plates. But a second proof gave the same result, with an even more distinct appearance of a human form. It is probable that Mumler had obtained the first spirit photograph. The report of the wonderful thing spread rapidly, and very soon the unfortunate amateur was besieged by questions coming from every quarter. In order to satisfy the curiosity of people, he was obliged to give 2 hours every day to this new branch of experimentation. Finally, his clientele became so large that he had to give up his business as an engraver. Eminent persons posed before his camera incognito, and it was only afterwards that Mumler came sometimes to know them. It appears that the photographer agreed to all the conditions that his visitors exacted in the way of control or verification. The forms that appeared in the picture were, if I am well informed, those of personalities, the recollection of whom was occupying the mind of the person who was posing. Presently, the eminent Boston photographer, Mr. Black, inventor of the nitrate of silver bath, began to investigate Mumler's methods. Through the mediation of a friend who had just obtained proof of a phantasm, Mr. Black offered $50 to Mumler if he would agree to do his work in his presence. The offer was accepted, and Mr. Black made it a duty to examine with the most scrupulous and critical accuracy the objective, the plates, receptacles, and baths. He never once took his eyes from the plate during its preliminary preparation, and carried it himself into the darkroom. Proceeding to develop it there, to his astonishment, he saw a spectral form on the plate, in the form of a man leaning on the shoulder of his friend. He carried away the negative and was so overwhelmed with amazement that he forgot at the time to pay his colleague. In consequence of this authentication of his work, Mumler was encouraged to continue his demonstrations publicly, and for this purpose opened a gallery in New York, where he succeeded in convincing his fellow photographers, Mr. Silver and Gurney. Furthermore, he never refused to take his pictures in their own studios, with their apparatus and their plates. The results were always the same. One day, Mr. Mumler was arrested in New York on accusation of sorcery and fraud. His prosecutors were clamorous, but his friends brought many testimonials, and he was released. Many at the time tried to imitate Mumler, with greater or less success. Yeah, so you're talking about being a medium then, aren't you? The medium takes the photographs. I'll end the review of this book with the last chapter, chapter 14, Biology of the Spirits. The facts relating to the activity of phantasms are so numerous and so well proved that we can permit ourselves to construct their biology and their psychology. The phantasmal forms appear to us in the form of lights and ignis fatui, or else in the form of hands, or even the images of men, though rarely complete in shape. These images are frequently preceded by a luminous vapour in the room, and more often on the head and on the abdomen of the medium. A vapour which always keeps getting more and more condensed until it assumes corporeal form. This shape passes from the immediate vicinity of the medium or the seance cabinet to some distance away and even moves around the room, making gestures and, more rarely, speaking, while the psychic in the meantime is in a state of supreme lethargy, deep trance. As soon as I have entered the mediumistic cabinet, says Madame d'Esperance, my first impression is of being covered with spider webs. This is the lady who was put in a net bag to undertake her experiments. Then I feel that the air is filled with substance and a kind of white and vaporous mass, quasi-luminous, like the steam from a locomotive, is formed in front of the abdomen. After this mass has been tossed and agitated in every way for some minutes, sometimes even for half an hour, it suddenly stops, and then out of it is born a living being close by me. Phantasms are covered with a white woven stuff, extremely fine, sometimes doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled. They seem to draw it out from the clothes of the medium. This mediumistic tissue is indispensable, as Katie King said to Sir William Crookes, as the envelope of their fluidic organism, and to keep it from dissolving in the light. Many, however, keep to the old fashions of their time and country, thus affording another proof of their identity. Frequently, when they find a difficulty in forming themselves, or, so to speak, solidifying themselves completely, besides the assistance rendered by their mediumistic garments, they have recourse to that of the curtains of the cabinet, wrapping themselves in these before they thrust out hands, arms, or head. The head is thus divined rather than observed directly, by means of the profile or by touching it. In mediumistic sculptures or imprints, also, they need to use this tissue, the impression of which is distinctly seen on the gypsum or plaster moulds. The phantasm materializes and grows out of the material substance of the medium, and certain ones have been observed to take on frequently a noteworthy increase in weight of body at the expense of that of the medium. Colonel Alcott, who in 1874 was experimenting with the psychic Compton, observed that when the young girl phantasm K appeared, the body of the psychic disappeared. Then he tied and sealed with sealing wax a string passing from the aperture of the medium's ear to the back of the chair in which she sat. Out of the invisible now stalks the spirit, which is at first found to weigh 77 pounds, later 58, and later still 52. In the meantime, the medium had disappeared, but reappeared as soon as the phantasm had gone, yet without pulse or breath. And Madame d'Esperance in 1893, while forming for herself Yolanda, saw that she herself had lost her knees and feet. But if she touched the place where they normally should be, she felt pain. Hence, an invisible part of them existed. This disappearance of the lower extremities was verified by many. Aksakoff himself made investigations amongst those who had seen her dematerialize herself. She herself directed the hands of the experimenters present in order that they might ascertain and thoroughly verify the disappearance of her legs. The witnesses authenticated the fact that her dress during the dematerialization hung vertically close to the chair, and then it filled out again without the medium moving from her seat. While all this was going on, she was affected with severe prostration and experienced inordinate thirst, whereas under other circumstances she never drank much. Gradually, as Yolanda disappeared, her sense of emptiness and of prostration diminished, and she regained her strength. In one of Eusapia's levitation seances also, Dr. Vezzano noticed that her lower limbs were lacking, and the guide control, John, explained that it was he who had caused them to dematerialize in order that her weight might be less for the levitation. In the experiments in Paris, it was found that during the levitation of a table, the weight of the medium diminished just the amount that the table weighed, returning to the normal amount after the levitation had ceased. How wonderful is that? And they're not the only people to talk about dematerializations of body parts. Pretty sure it's in Alec Harris's story, where he had a scar on his leg. And they, for some reason, the spirit people had to dematerialize that part of his body, if not all of him, I'm not sure. But whomsoever this was, it may not have been Alec Harris, but whomsoever had their lower leg dematerialized, when it was rematerialized, it was perfect. The scar had been completely removed. That's definitely in one of the books I've read. Well, I hope you enjoyed our preamble through Cesare Lombroso's book, After Death What. He'll explain a great deal of what is after death in this book for you to read. It's a wonderful book full of all kinds of stories of the paranormal. The ghost stories in particular are really interesting. We've gone through a lot of ghost stories ourselves in our videos. And it was very interesting to hear of the witnesses to people seeing spirit forms, witnesses seeing levitations of chairs occupied by mediums, levitation of tables, and of dematerializations of body parts of a variety of mediums, not just the one. And thus, having read the book, we can understand why Cesare Lombroso became a committed spiritualist. Thank you very much.